Hello, everyone. I'm really excited to have you here tonight to join us and to hear our fantastic speakers, Frances O'Grady and Sir Vince Cable. Really huge welcome on behalf of the Social Liberal Forum. I want to just make a point at the beginning that we are recording this event. And so please note, if you need to be anonymous, you might, if you want to ask a question, it's going to be recorded and we will be putting this on the Social Liberal Forum website afterwards. So just take note of that. My name is Sue Wixley and I'm really excited to be hosting us here tonight. I'm a member of the Social Liberal Forum Council that I joined last year in the summer. And I have heard that there's a legendary event, Social Liberal Forum event, that we held with Frances O'Grady and Sir Vince a few years ago, where apparently we had to lock the doors. Luckily, we won't be locking any doors because we all locked down ourselves tonight, but we have a fantastic attendance and I know even more people will be joining us later and also watching this later, the recorded version. Can I invite everyone who's just joined us to think about questions? There will be lots of time for questions and discussion, and to please put them in the Q&A box down below, not in the chat, but feel free to join us on the chat as well. It's a huge pleasure to welcome you to tonight and to introduce you to Frances O'Grady, who will kick us off. Just a bit of background about Frances, who we all know, and indeed both speakers barely need an introduction, but I think it's good to remind ourselves. So Frances O'Grady has been the General Secretary of the Trades Union Congress since 2013. She's the first woman to hold that position. Frances has previously worked for the Transport and General Workers Union, where she campaigned for the introduction of a national minimum wage and equal pay. And at the TUC, she has worked on industrial policy and the case for strategic rebalancing of the economy after the 2008 financial crash. Frances has been a member of the Resolution Foundation's Commission on Living Standards, as well as serving on the TUC's Commission on Vulnerable Employment, the Low Pay Commission and the High Pay Commission. She campaigned prominently during the referendum of EU membership as the TUC registered for the Remain side, particularly citing concerns around the impact of workers' rights and jobs in export-led economies and industries. And in 2019, Frances was appointed as a non-executive director at the Bank of England. So I'm very excited to welcome her and to invite you, Frances, please, just to share your opening thoughts on this really important topics on priorities for a new economy.
Well, thank you so much, Sue, for that introduction, and thank you to you and to forum members for the invitation. I really appreciate that idea that we should have open and constructive and positive dialogue and conversation. So thank you so much. I also have to say it's a pleasure to have an action replay in respect of our dialogue with Vince. I was going to say that I think it's a relationship of mutual respect. I hope it is, Vince. But just to say, you know, when Vince was business secretary, I will never forget the work that he did with our unions to save the Ellesmere port plants when General Motors was threatening to close it. You know, I remember you getting on planes, Vince, to New York and Geneva and having those meetings and rolling up your sleeves and sorting it out. And just to say, in the trade union movement, we have long memories. So I just want to record our thanks for that. I mean, clearly we are meeting at an incredibly critical time. You know, I think many of us had our hearts lifted by news of the vaccine. We really are hoping that that rollout goes well. We're putting our shoulders to the wheel in terms of our own membership in trying to make that happen. But I think we also know that in these awful, awful COVID pandemic times, that our NHS in many areas is at risk of being overwhelmed. And frankly, when I speak to staff in the NHS, they are exhausted. They are absolutely on their knees. And they know that, alongside many others, they know that every time they put on that uniform, they are putting their own health on the line. So, you know, I know that everybody would join me in recognising their contribution and the value of the labour that they give. But I think there's also something very profound has happened, I think, which has been that this pandemic has exposed very, very deep lines of inequality and poverty that were there before the pandemic ever happened, but have been entrenched by it. And, you know, again, for me personally, that debate about what it takes to feed a poor child for a week, you know, a couple of spuds and a can of beans, you know, that again felt sort of something very deep and profound and awful about that. We're also, of course, seeing job losses, and a lot of people are suffering across a lot of sectors, but without doubt, it's young people on the front line of those job losses, and it's Black and ethnic minority people. We just put out a report today who are being hit much harder too, you know, first in line in terms of hours cuts, pay cuts, onto furlough, onto less money, and through the door onto redundancy. So again, I think, you know, I think it's pulled many of us up short to see just how stark that picture is. And if this wasn't enough, and again, you know, my heart's on my sleeve through that introduction, we've also got Brexit. You know, I mentioned the car industry earlier and Vince's role in protecting our manufacturing base. Well, you know, the car industry is in trouble now. I noticed Jacob Rees-Mogg was talking about British fish being happy. I have to say the people fishing them not so happy, and an awful lot of industries in real trouble. And then on top of that, as many will have seen on Friday's front page of the Financial Times, we hear that all along the government has been conducting a review into workers' rights, part of a broader piece of work about what can be deregulated now that we are out of the EU. And again, this feels very personal to me. It feels incredibly ironic that you know, the paper was highlighting the Working Time Directive, which people will know puts safe limits on the number of hours you can work a week, gives you rights to rest breaks, and of course is critical for calculating holiday pay. And of course, the very people who are most likely to lose from any deregulation in that area are Britain's army of key workers, particularly care workers, who again, you know, I've been working very closely with the unions representing them, you know, majority women, the majority of care workers on less than £10 an hour, huge numbers on 0 hours contracts, agency contracts, the people who were wrapping themselves in bin liners because they didn't, at the start of this pandemic, have any adequate PPE. They are the people, the very people who are most likely to lose from any attack on workers' rights. And, you know, we know that this is part of the search, if you like, for the Brexit dividend. What was the point of winning these freedoms if they're not used? And frankly, you know, a hard right flank in the Conservative Party that wants to see some action, has long wanted to see some action on this, including some members of the cabinet who wrote that pamphlet Britannica Unchained that described British workers as the worst idlers in the world. So we know what this is about, but we don't want to be just defending what we've got. This government promised that the future of the economy would be about strengthening and enhancing workers' rights. And yet so far, no sight nor sound of the employment bill that we were promised would do that. In terms of the TUC's priorities, I just want to touch on a few. We know we've got big challenges around what happens with Brexit, how we recover from COVID, artificial intelligence we're doing a lot of work on because we've seen a spike in the application of algorithms at work. And of course, critically, climate change in this year of COP. But I guess our key message is that we do not believe it is possible to build back better unless we put decent work and decent rights and decent living standards for working people at the heart of that mission. And we want to see a greener economy too. We want to see a just transition with, again, issues like skills and education being absolutely central to how do we transform our economy so that we create the good green jobs that people want in the parts of the country that desperately need them most. So, you know, we want to be part of the conversation around a new, greener, fairer industrial strategy for the future. We've set out quite detailed plans for example, £85 billion worth of investment in electric transport, green tech, and critically resilient public services, because I don't think we can forget the lessons of austerity and indeed this pandemic. And we've also called for investment in, and I know this was close to Vince's heart when he was business secretary, rebuilding domestic supply chains for manufacturing, again, so that we've got security for that industry going forward. But we are also concerned about the social dimension, not just workers' rights, but social protection too. And again, hopefully people will have seen that, you know, we were there at the start saying, unless we sort out sick pay, people will be faced with that invidious choice of wanting to do the right thing and self-isolate when they should, but simply not being able to afford to, because people have got to put food on the table for their kids too. You know, that's an invidious choice, but it's also a public health hazard. And I think we need to learn the lessons in terms of sick pay and welfare too. And equality is always going to be at the heart of what we do. You know, it's pretty clear, and I think if we ever get the public inquiry we're calling for, it will be pretty clear who has paid the highest price for this pandemic. And, you know, frankly, it looks like very many of them have been rewarded with a pay freeze for their trouble. The role of trade unions, we also see, and it's actually really encouraging to hear Joe Biden talking so positively about his view of a 21st century New Deal, but with, you know, I'm a union guy, Joe Biden also seeing unions as having an important role in resetting that balance of power and dealing with some of the injustices that people have faced too long. Right at the start of this pandemic, I feel really proud actually of the union movement, that we were there pushing for and securing health and safety guidelines. We want them reviewed, we want them stronger, but we, you know, I know if it hadn't been for us, we wouldn't have got them at all. For furlough, the first time we've had a wage subsidy scheme in this country, and support, not good enough, but nevertheless some support for the self-employed. I also know that wouldn't have happened without unions in the TUC. And we also called for a National Recovery Council. Maybe I'm too optimistic on this front, or maybe what seems like common sense to me doesn't seem like common sense to others. But it seems to me that, you know, decent businesses, unions have worked incredibly constructively together through this pandemic. We call out bad employers when we have to, but we work constructively with the good ones. We've worked really closely in a whole range of sectors from retail onwards. And we thought a National Recovery Council was the way to use government convening power to bring business and unions together to work out practical plans for recovery and resilience for the future. I mean, I see yesterday the government called a meeting of, I think it's called the Build Back Better Council, which looks incredibly similar in detail to the proposal we set out, with one omission, which is that unions are locked out on the outside, which, you know, seems a wasted opportunity. And just finally, a kind of bit of a somber thought from me, but I think many of us have been watching very closely events on Capitol Hill. And, you know, for my part, you know, I'm very clear that what we're seeing, and certainly from our friends in our sister union body in the AFL-CIO, who were out there actually defending staff in polling stations during the election, because it was pretty heavy in a number of places. And part of, you know, I think unions have a really important part to play as part of wider civic society in protecting and defending democracy. But in my view, you know, we have seen increasing inequality and polarization in the States. I don't think President Trump came from nowhere. I don't think that some of the people who support him, like the Proud Boys, come from nowhere. And I think there is a very kind of sober lesson for us all about how the seeds of racism and white supremacism are sown. In what kinds of conditions is that more likely to grow and feel free to express itself? And I think we have to be humble enough to learn some of those lessons in this country, particularly as we face the prospect, according to the OBR, of 2.6 million people being unemployed, mass unemployment. We know the conditions from our own history, and we can see it across the pond. So, you know, that's why the TUC and unions, we will always champion the cause of more, as I see it, economic democracy, fair treatment for working people, and critically, dignity and decency at work. Thank you very much, Sue.
Thank you very much, Frances. That was a fantastic introduction. I think captures the emotions that we've all been through in this very mad, almost year. The highs and a lot of the lows, I think very sobering, reminding us of the realities and the many challenges. The reason that we've got 110 people on tonight, you know, issues we're really wrestling with. And I hope also energizing and helping us to think about the future and whatever we call this council, you know, thinking about this recovery and beginning to think about what it looks like when we get out the other end. So thank you. That was a fantastic start for our evening. I want to welcome everyone who has arrived since we began. It's great to have you here. You will see a note from Andy Galloway, who's our technical guru, thank goodness, who's helping with the Q&A. If you have any questions, please put them in the box down below, and he will be in charge of inviting you to come and speak on and pose your question to our fantastic speakers on priorities for a new economy. And also one thing to just remind everyone, we are recording this event and we will be posting it in the next few days on our website. So just to note that, I think most people are used to that these days with Zoom. It's now a huge pleasure to invite our second speaker and just introduce quickly first Sir Vince, who, as you will know, was the leader of the Liberal Democrats between 2017 and 2019, Member of Parliament for Twickenham from 1997 to 2015, and again from 2017 to 2019. Also served in the cabinet and one of the reasons why it's so exciting to have the two of you here tonight as Secretary of State for Business, Innovation and Skills from 2010 to 2015. As people will know, Sir Vince is an economist, trained as an economist, was an economic advisor in Kenya, to the Commonwealth Secretariat and to Shell in the 1990s. And just because it's quite nice to be reminded that in May 2019, led the Liberal Democrats to the best national electoral performance since the 2010 election, gaining us 15 seats in the European Parliament under our fantastic slogan, Bollocks to Brexit. So I am really excited to invite you, Sir Vince, to make a few introductory remarks, and then I will invite both of you to kind of comment on each other's initial points, and then it will be great to open up to questions from the audience. So Vince, over to you.
Oh, thank you. I can see the internet connection is a bit wobbly. I don't know whether it's me or you, but thank you for setting this up. And thanks to Frances for joining us. It's terrific. I mean, in the 5 years when I was Secretary of State, I mean, her job was to hold us to account, and she did it brilliantly, I thought. Always fair, always constructive, was critical of things we did, and rightly so. But a really, really positive influence for the trade union movement. And I've always admired the work she does. I just want to make, I think I've got a list of 5 points to make to take the discussion on. I think, first of all, there is a lot of overlap between the things which Frances has been saying and the issues around social justice and the economy. They're not separate, competing objectives. For example, there are a lot of people at the present who are going out to work who shouldn't be. I mean, they should be at home, social distancing, but they can't because of the deficiency of sickness benefits or because their employers are not putting them onto furlough. And this is prolonging the pandemic, and it's, you know, just rooted in hardship and the fact that people can't afford to comply with the regulations which have been imposed. And when we get past this, if we're going to recover, there will need to be a lot of spending. And at the moment, old fogies like me who've, you know, got money in the bank because we've retired, will be doing a lot of that. But actually, there are millions of people who are so financially insecure that they will not be able to participate, you know, beyond, you know, basic subsistence. And that's actually one of the reasons why it's so important that we push for this increase in universal credit, not just as a temporary stopgap, as a permanent measure to alleviate poverty. I mean, the universal credit has got some deficiencies, but a lot of the problems are to do with its lack of generosity, and that needs dealing with for economic reasons, quite apart from social reasons. I think the second point I want to make is, you know, later this year, there will be a recovery. I mean, we're not going to get the V-shaped, U-shaped recovery we were promised. We're getting a W-shaped recovery after 2 periods of recession. But, you know, there will be recovery, and it might be quite spectacular for a while. And there's a real danger, I think, that we then are lulled into a sense of complacency that the economy is getting back to normal. I mean, unfortunately, it's not going to happen because there will be a large amount of residual unemployment. There is a chronic lack of investment taking place at the moment, and that's going to continue. And because there are going to be some really big, long-lasting social scars, I mean, around poverty, mental health, remedial education, and all of these things are going to have to be paid for. So, you know, we could get into a kind of recovery mindset, the roaring 20s, people have called it, but there are some big long-term issues to deal with. Thirdly, specifically on unemployment, I mean, we don't yet know how serious the problem will be because it's hidden in the furlough scheme, but we may be getting up to 3 million, 8 to 10%. It could be a lot worse than that because there will be a lot of hidden unemployment with people leaving the labor force. In some ways, this is sort of easier to deal with than the last big unemployment period we had in the 80s, the Thatcher years, because we're no longer dealing with middle-aged steel workers. You know, we're dealing with young people who've left the service sector, and a lot of them can be re-employed quite quickly. But there will be some serious problems. A lot of those people won't be able to get back into the labor force. A lot of the old jobs will have gone. And of course, not everybody's young and agile and mobile. So there's I think some good thinking going on that we need to build on. I saw Gordon Brown leading a lot of that, and, you know, some very good thoughts, sensible thoughts. But we need to be thinking about things like adaptation to the benefit system to make part-time working easier, less penal, as it often is. A lot of money really needs to go into adult education, continuing education. There's going to be a lot of need for funding for retraining, you know, getting people into caring professions, for example, who've been doing other things. and support for new employment. At the moment, a lot of money is going into the furlough scheme, and rightly so, but that needs to switch to supporting new employment. So my fourth point is, one of the things we're going to be left with, and this is partly the pandemic, partly Brexit, other things, is that there's a chronic lack of investment, particularly in, manufacturing industry, because of all the uncertainty. And one of the things I've been pushing, I did a pamphlet on this for Radix just before Christmas, is the industrial strategy. We can use different words for it, but we have the structures already set up, and they've been quite active at various times. Michael Heseltine took this seriously, Peter Mandelson did, I did. They've fallen a little bit into decline, but the structures are there, the sectors are there, the policies are there, but it does require political leadership. We know that employers and trade unions are willing to work together on all this, but it does require government leadership and coordination and the resources put behind it, and critically taking a long-term view, which is what we've been very bad at in the UK, but is even more imperative now that we're trying to build in a sustainability agenda. And the final point I want to make is around the budget. Fiscal policy, monetary policy, the big economic management issues. There is a real danger that the very good response that the government made a year ago, and that the Treasury for once was pretty expansive and ambitious, that's being choked off too early. We see plenty of signs at the moment of panic in the Treasury. They're being warned by people like the OECD and the IMF, actually, not just by people on the left, but international institutions, that they're panicking too early. There isn't an enormous problem of piling up more debt. I mean, it's now 120% of GDP, but it's higher in the US, much higher in Japan. And as long as interest rates are very low, it's a perfectly sustainable position. And I think the thing is not to trivialize it. I mean, there is an issue. I mean, I don't believe in magic money trees in the long run. You can in the short run, but in the long run, this has to be paid for. But it can be paid for over 20, 30 years with, gradual economic recovery. A certain amount of inflation will deal with the debt problem without choking off recovery. I mean, I know I was part of a government that was criticized for doing that. I think I would justify it by saying we were dealing with very different circumstances, a banking collapse, but maybe we did panic and maybe we did cut off recovery when we shouldn't have done. But certainly we shouldn't do so now, and it would be an unnecessary mistake. And there are ways of managing this. There was a very good letter this morning by Charles Goodhart, the great Charles Goodhart, under a letter from Francis, actually, in the Financial Times, explaining how the Treasury, working with the Bank of England, can manage the deficit financing that we're going to have to do fairly extensively for a long period of time. So those are my points, and I'm happy to come to questions later. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I think fascinating introductions, lots to agree on, and some kind of covering a whole range of areas. I'm keen to, before I open up to Q&A, and I really want to invite everyone to put their questions in the Q&A box at the bottom, and note if you don't want to ask the question yourself on the screen. That's also fine. We can just read the question out for you. But just to begin with, I want to invite both Francis and Sir Vince perhaps to just situate the current economic situation we're in with the pandemic and Brexit in a historic context. Do you compare it to 2008? Do we need to go further back, to the Great Depression, to the Black Death? Do we have to go back 700 centuries to find comparisons? Where do you situate our current situation right now, or perhaps even is it too soon to say?
Do you want me to kick off with that?
Yes, that would be great. Thanks.
This isn't the Black Death. I mean, please, that killed a third of the population. We're talking about 0.5%, which is terrible for, obviously, for the people's families who are affected, but it's not remotely on that scale. But if we're talking about historical precedents, what it is in the UK's case, the precedent is 1921, 22, after the First World War, a combination of demobilization and the flu pandemic, the Spanish flu pandemic, and also some pretty bad economic policy. There was a gold standard and very rigid approach to the economic management, and they created a collapse of about 10 to 12% in the economy, GDP, which is actually what we're going to experience this time. Last year, roughly that order of magnitude, one of the worst of the in the world, actually. It's roughly comparable to India, but most other countries have got off with rather less. So that's in context. The Great Depression of the 30s didn't actually affect the UK in quite the same way as it did the United States. But in the United States, they lost about a third of their GDP. It was a catastrophic fall. Roosevelt came in with the mandate to try and do something about it. So we're only about a third as bad as that. I mean, that's not terribly a relief, but you asked me to put it in historical context. And so we are dealing with a 1 in a century event. We're reliving the events of almost exactly a century ago.
Thank you. And Francis, any thoughts from you or kind of lessons, parallels from 2008 or other reflections?
I guess it depends what we're measuring. In some ways, it's almost, I feel, too soon to measure the health consequences, because I feel quite cautious about how this is going to pan out over this year, leading into the autumn with new variants and so on, that can spread more quickly. And of course, it's the threat to the NHS that's the kind of big concern, as well as the personal bereavements that people are suffering. It's what happens if the NHS was overwhelmed. But it depends how you measure it, because of course, in terms of living standards, we can go back even further and say, well, this is the longest squeeze on living standards we've had since Napoleonic times. It's been pretty critical for working people for a long time. And that, just kind of, there's so many kind of shared observations, I think, between Vince and myself. But, one observation on the child's poverty challenge is, of course, as everyone knows, the majority of children who are poor have at least one parent at work. And, that is a real shift, I think, in the profile of poverty in this country. And, in a way, we shouldn't just be talking about vouchers or what goes into a free meals box. It should be, how do we tackle the source of this, which is very often low pay. I also just, kind of really agreed with Vince in terms of it being too soon to pull the plug. I mean, on the contrary, I would be arguing for, this is the very time. We don't have to wait for furlough to end before we start investing in new jobs. This should be the time when we should be doing it. And also thinking hard about areas that are good jobs rich, because some of the shiny new projects, which may have value in themselves, that the Prime Minister is so keen on, but they don't necessarily produce many jobs. So I think we have to kind of think about the sequencing and priorities of that investment. And just finally, what I should have said in my introduction is, another area where business and unions are in violent agreement is that we need certainty. In other countries like France and Germany, they're saying their furlough schemes won't end until the pandemic ends. All the evidence is, in lots of industries, we can produce the evidence that shows firms are not dipping into furlough unless they have to. And some of those who were at the start, very large numbers have come out of furlough, and some are even paying it back, So why have this stop-go, constant uncertainty where, you know, it's uncertainty for business in terms of planning for the future, but massive uncertainty for working families who are literally being issued with notices of redundancy and not knowing whether those are going to be followed through or not. You know, I mean, there has to be a better way than running policy because the Chancellor wants to keep some announcements for his budget. You know, I mean, that to me does not seem to be the most important thing here. The most important thing is to ensure that livelihoods and production and productivity are as secure as they can be during these terrible times.
Thank you. Fantastic start. And thank you again to everyone who's joined us. I'm going to hand over or invite Andy to help with the questions. I know we've got quite a number of questions. Andy.
Yeah, we have.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Sue. Yeah, great. Thanks, Sue, and thanks, Vince and Francis, for great insights there. I'll just be inviting Nell to speak in a second, but just first, just to kind of echo what Sue said about the Q&A. I'll be drawing from the Q&A box, so keep asking your questions in there. Make sure you keep thumbs upping any questions you want to be asked. If there are any similar ones, then obviously we'll ask someone to speak, and I might tick some of them as answered if they've been covered. Yeah, we'll go from there, and just encourage everyone to put questions forwards. And like Sue said, if anyone would prefer not to sort of come on the screen to ask their question, then either either ask it anonymously or put it in the question, or when I message you to raise your hand, then just let me know and I can ask the question for you instead. But yeah, first I'll just ask Nell to come up and be a panelist for a second. You should be rejoining now. It'll take a second for people to join, and I'll leave everyone on the screen, and then once they've asked the question and had it answered, then I'll let people go back to be a participant. But Nell, I think you can unmute. And
Andy, I can't see my question any longer. So could you ask it for me, please?
Oh, where are you?
Can you see me? No.
I can see
Oh,
there you are.
Hello, Francis. Hello, Vince. I can't see my question any longer. Would you mind asking it for me, because it's not on my screen now?
Yeah, no. So you wrote government
hold on. Is this it? No, you ask it, please. I can't see it.
No worries, that's all right. So you wrote government with large majorities created by lies to a disenfranchised electorate looks like a very strange version of democracy. Do we need a totally new way of looking at how we govern? If the UK was a firm, it would look like a failed enterprise.
Thank you.
I'd like to go first. Francis. Francis, would you like to go first?
Well, I mean, I kind of understand where that question's coming from. I mean, the government has a very significant majority. Clearly, there's a very big debate about first past the post and proportional representation. And I think a kind of deepening debate about what this, frankly, currently disunited kingdom is going to look like post-Brexit with, you know, again, I'd be interested in Vince's views, but my sense is that there is, you know, certainly some momentum in Scotland now, at the very least looking for a different relationship. And we hear the government is even, you know, playing around with ideas of federalism and so on. So there's kind of, you know, big questions about our electoral system, but also questions, I think, as we've seen increasingly with mayors in the north, for example, a frustration around voices feeling that they're not heard. So, you know, it does feel as if, you know, this is not my mastermind subject. The TUC doesn't have a policy position on electoral reform, but all my instincts tell me that there is a dissatisfaction, a discontent with the settlement, and something is going to have to shift. You know, and I guess my own view is that I absolutely recognise that it's in the government's prerogative whether or not there will be a referendum in Scotland, for example. But I think if that pressure were to mount even further, I think in the end, people have a right to decide, and you can't withhold that right from them indefinitely. It's not something I personally want to see, but I think people have the right to decide.
Yes, I would just add, I think that, the political system has been shown up to be horribly dysfunctional, and not just in the UK, but countries that have got political systems based on partisanship rather than cooperation and consensus have done spectacularly badly, particularly the UK and the US. And countries that have organized their political system around trying to build consensus, and Germany is the best example in Europe. But the Far Eastern countries, which have done particularly well, Taiwan, Korea, all fall into that box. So we've seen the practical consequences of having governments which represent under 50% of the population. I think the other point I would make is that I think we're now paying the price for something successive governments have done, which is over-centralizing the economy. We've got, the leeching away of all the power of local government. We've seen it happening over 30, 40 years. That used to be a great source of energy and innovation. It's no longer there. People taking their instructions in Whitehall. So, breathing life back into local government, whether they're through the mayor system or conventional local government, seems to be absolutely imperative. I agree that the UK is now a very fragile institution, and not just Scotland. I would be surprised if there isn't growing pressure for a border poll in Northern Ireland. And as far as Scotland is concerned, there will be an election in May and we'll see what happens. But I suspect that whole argument has got past the point of no return. But that's just a personal judgment.
Thank you.
Thank you. And
sorry, go on.
Just to plug Citizens Britain, one of our recent reports that the Social Liberal Forum did, which kind of reimagines our democracy, talks about the role of citizens and how we can transfer power and how we can involve everyone in deciding about their lives. And I'm sure somebody will stick a link on the chat.
John's in the chat. I'm sure he'll dig a link.
I'm imagining that. Back to questions.
Thanks, Nell. I'm just going to make you a participant again. The next question comes from Paul, who I'm just going to promote now. Bear with. There we are. Paul, you can just unmute.
Okay, hi. You lose the Q&A, you lose the question when it happens. That's what I've.
Yeah, everyone remember your question before you come in. Write it down.
So how do we build support and awareness for the fundamentally important change of introducing a land value tax? And do any unions currently support that?
Oh, blimey. Oh, Paul, I'm sorry, I haven't come well briefed enough on this one. I know it's been a huge debate more broadly, and I think there's certainly kind of sympathy in a number of unions. But can I get back to you on that? If you need, okay. I'm just going to be honest and say somehow at home, away from the office, I would need to go and check.
I guess that demonstrates the lack of awareness, though, doesn't it?
Yeah, probably.
I'm sure Vince has something to say on this.
Yes, I think this is an issue that needs to get beyond kind of niche politics. There is now an acceptance, I think, in the Treasury, let alone anywhere else, that if we're going to reform the tax system, there's going to be a shift towards the taxation of land and/or property. A, because it can't run away to the Bahamas. B, because property and land values have been massively boosted by the way we do monetary policy. A lot of people have become very rich simply by sitting still and not doing anything. The value of their assets have gone through the roof. And it's also created tremendous social hardship because young people, young families can't get onto property. They're stuck in rented accommodation with young children, which is fragile, vulnerable, uncertain, insecure, all those things. So it really, really matters. I mean, you know, land value tax is the pure form of this. I mean, I would be happy if we got ahead with something the Treasury are believed to be looking at, which is just having a taxing the value of property in relation to the price of the homes, which would be massively helpful to the poorer parts of the country because they would have less taxation, and people like me who've been fortunate to get stuck in the right kind of semi-detached house in the right part of the country and have become millionaires as a result would have to pay quite a lot more. And that seems to me a sensible way of looking at taxation.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Vince. I'm just going to invite now Diana to come and ask your question. Just promoting you now, and Paul, I will make you a participant again. Diana, if you want to unmute.
Can you see me now? Can you hear me?
I can hear you. We can't see you.
Oh, does that matter?
That's okay. You can turn your camera on if you want, but don't worry.
Up to you. Go ahead, Diana.
Good, thank you. It's actually much the same as what Vince was talking about. Can we stop trying to fund government spending by borrowing, but go to progressive taxation on incomes and assets? Funding it by borrowing merely makes the rich richer. Did you get all that?
Yeah, I mean,
yes.
I mean, Diana, from my point of view, I think there is a long overdue discussion about progressive taxation, and I think there's a long overdue discussion about how much inequality is actually driven by wealth inequality rather than income inequality. And I wouldn't mind just starting with ensuring that those at the top paid what they owe. You know, that would be a good start too. I wouldn't necessarily pitch it against borrowing to invest, because I think, you know, we need significant investment in this country if we're really going to hit those targets on climate change, but also if we're going to provide decent lives for people, decent homes and communities. So I think there is a real case for ramping up investment now. And as Vince said earlier, you know, it's still the case that the cost of borrowing is very low. This is the time to do it rather than wait.
Yes, that's absolutely right. I completely agree with that. And I think in the question, there were two issues which were being mixed up. There's nothing wrong with government borrowing, providing it's for good projects and providing the cost is cheap and you get a return from it. That's what public investment is for, and there's nothing wrong with it, whatever. And it doesn't in itself help widen inequality. I mean, what has widened inequality is the way that the monetary policy has worked. It was necessary to do it, to pump money into the banking system, which is essentially what's happened. But it has had the effect of puffing up the prices of assets, shares, and housing particularly. And that's clearly reached the end of its usefulness. But I don't want us to get us into the way of thinking that government borrowing for investment is a bad idea. I mean, one of the mistakes actually in the coalition, we had a lot of rows behind the scenes about it, was that when we came into office, the commitment was to cut the so-called current deficit of the budget, but to leave investment untouched. But then the Treasury got at it and decided they'd cut investment as well, and at the worst possible time. And that caused a lot of damage, unnecessary damage to infrastructure building, and caused a lot of unnecessary unemployment. But we shouldn't, in any sense, turn against sensible borrowing to invest.
Thank you, Diana. Shall I go see?
Sorry, Andy, who's next?
I'll just put Diana back into the other room. And we've got Alan up next. So I'm just going to promote Alan through now. He's got a question I'm sure lots of people will be interested in. Alan, oh, there you are.
Hello, good evening. Hope you can hear me. Good evening, everybody. Very interesting discussion. I'm actually an economist, but I'm sorry to say that my question is more about the politics of the current situation. So I'm assuming that a lot of members of the Social Liberal Forum would probably agree on a number of the sort of issues that have been brought up this evening and what the problem is. But my question is more about, in the current context of a Conservative government that's got an 80-seat majority, 3-4 years until the next general election, what practically can the Liberal Democrats do over the next few years to make a difference? So my question to both Vince and to Francis would be, if you were able to, well, you probably do have the ear of Ed Davey, but what would your suggestions be for the top 3 priorities for the next 12 months and beyond in terms of what the Lib Dems can actually do to make a difference? Thank you.
Well, number one is doing the only thing which is feasible at present, which is to sort of rebuild the local government base, which got badly shredded, and we had a very good result in 2019, but it needs to be repeated, and that establishes a base. I think secondly, you've got to win an argument for going back into power and into Parliament. You're not going to go there by serendipity or, you know, appealing to people's good nature. You've got to make the case, and you know, we clearly we're in a bad place and had 3 bad general elections. Our policy is currently dominated, or was dominated, by Europe, and we've got to move beyond that. And I think Ed Davey is actually saying sensible things about the economy and about equality, about the environment, these things that matter to people, and over time it will sink in. I think a third thing, and the controversial thing, is I think accepting this time out that there is only going to be a change of government if the main opposition parties work together. I mean, I'm not suggesting that we have a electoral pact, it's not going to happen. But I came into Parliament first in 1997 when there was a tacit understanding between Blair's Labour Party and Ashdown's Liberal Democrats that we concentrate on different parts of the country and maximise our number of seats, which is basically what happened. And you then get an opportunity, at least, to get into Parliament, do things socially, economically, and with the voting system to improve things. So those are the 3 things: you know, local government, refocusing on policy, and then an understanding amongst the progressive parties of the centre left that they're going to have to work together.
I mean, Alan, I'd probably, you know, it's probably not my place to give advice to Ed Davey or any other politician, frankly, but I would make a couple of observations that although this government has a very significant majority, actually a large majority can be a mixed blessing for any government. And, you know, I know, for example, everybody knows that they are struggling to reconcile what their MPs in the red wall seats are saying with what other parts of the parliamentary party is saying. You know, what is the vision? And as a kind of TUC, obviously we're not affiliated to any party, but we do have a real interest in what working people across the board want. And it seems to me there has been quite a big significant shift right across the board in terms of working people, regardless of which way they voted, wanting that kind of old-fashioned notion, really, of a fair deal at work. You know, a fair day's reward, a fair day's pay for a fair day's work, fair treatment, particularly for adult children, very often caught in insecure jobs, a sense of hope for their local communities, and they want delivery on promises. You know, one of the attractions for some people in voting Brexit was the sense of governments hiding behind the skirts of Brussels and not being held accountable for what should be done here. And so I think there is a kind of, you know, a real potential to build a much bigger consensus around a decent life for working families and what that means. And I think it's very popular in the country, as we know, and hasn't quite found its voice yet. I think we're hopefully doing our bit. But I think politicians of all stripes are going to have to talk about how do we make life better in material, measurable ways for, you know, ordinary people, everyday people who want life to get better. How is that going to be delivered?
Great. Thank you, Alan, and thank you, Francis, Vince. I'm going to come, actually, just before I bring the next people through, I'll probably just say, because we probably only got another 15 minutes or so on the questions, if for the next few questions, if you can kind of direct maybe to either Francis or Vince, just for sort of the main answer, and then maybe if the other wants to chip in, then we can. Just because it's sort of related to that, and probably is one maybe more for Francis, I'm going to bring Nigel through, who's coming through now, and then I will come to Ian, who's got a question after that. So Nigel, if you're able to unmute.
Right, okay, sorry about that, pressing the wrong buttons. Yeah, so my question, which of course has now disappeared, oh, there it is, is, no, it's gone, is is there a way for the Lib Dems to work better with the trade union movement? It's long been a concern of mine. I think my first ever letter to a paper was about this back in the 70s or 80s, but it seems to me that we sometimes struggle, and particularly since coalition, of course, having our voice heard amongst trade unions. Whereas before that, I mean, I worked very well with Unison on various campaigns as a district councillor back in the noughties. A lot of our councillors, and I'm one, are ex-trade unionists and do a great deal of work. But equally, we've got a lot of colleagues who are very dismissive of the union viewpoint as well. And it just seems to me that we shouldn't have an antipathy. We should be working hand in glove as much as we can. But I suppose the second point of my question, which I think I put in the thing, was, I mean, are the trade unions always going to back Labour ahead of the Lib Dems?
Oh, great question, Nigel. I take it this one's for me.
It certainly is.
For both of you, really, but yes, but you primarily.
I mean, you know, it'd be great if ex-members became current members, because I do think, you know, unions are democratic bodies, and you know, I'm not saying we're perfect, but we do have to take account of what our own members are saying and thinking, and we do have to recognise that we're a broad church. We're not a political party. As you know, I want to be straight, most of our big unions, you know, the big five, are affiliated to the Labour Party. I don't see that changing anytime soon, but the majority of our 48 unions are not affiliated to any party. And even those who are affiliated, as you mentioned, Unison, you know, recognise it's important to have good, mature, constructive relations with parties across the board. And, you know, I don't think, you know, Christina McAnee, the new General Secretary of Unison, she's always going to believe that her members will be better off under a Labour-led or Labour government. You know, that's why they affiliate. But I think you'll find she's somebody who wants good, grown-up dialogue across the board. And I have to say, I think the forum plays a really, really important part in that. You know, certainly, you know, I think TUC-wise, we've had really good engagement over a long period of time, you know, maybe not as frequent, or, you know, it's perhaps been stop go, but that relationship is well established. And I think there's a sort of degree of good faith, if you like, that allows us to have an honest discussion. And for me, that's always the start of being able to find solutions, is if you can develop a good faith relationship. You don't have to agree on everything, but you can always find something that you will agree on. And I know we've worked, you know, really closely, I think, you know, with a whole range of allies on issues like poverty, child poverty. That's something that unites us all. And so sometimes concentrating on those, what we have in common rather than what divides us, I think is a good start.
Yes, I would just add to that. I mean, the view I took when I was in government, I still take, is that the tripartite concept of business working with trade unions with government is the kind of structure we should be thinking about, rather than picking one particular dimension of it. There's also small business, and you know, they have their representation in small business Federation and the Chambers of Commerce, but it's a very unorganized group. I mean, nobody's really there speaking up for the freelancers. I mean, Francis has, actually, to her credit, during this pandemic. But there are now millions of people who are voluntarily or involuntarily self-employed, who need a voice, and I would hope that the Lib Dems speak up for them without trying to colonize them. And just the last point I would make is, I think Francis will correct my numbers, but I think the trade unions, about 6 million public sector, 1.5 million private, something like that. So there's a vast number of private sector workers who are not represented by anybody. And I think if, you know, Lib Dems in their workplace should try and make a contribution to that, and try to help organize groups within private companies, and make sure they have a voice.
Thank you, Nigel. I am going to ask a question posed by John Alexander, who's left the room, but he left a great question for us. And it reads, how do we stop the idea that austerity is a necessary reaction? How do we stop that taking hold again, as per the IEA on Newsnight endlessly? And how do we challenge that underlying framework that says that the economy of the nation is like the economy of the household? And it seems to some very sensible, but clearly that's incorrect in many ways. Keen to hear your thoughts. I don't know who would like to come first.
Well, okay, I'll say something. I hate this whole argument around austerity. It's completely meaningless. I mean, you know, anybody in government, whether they're left, right, centre, has to make choices, and there has to be priorities. And actually, one of the things which Gordon Brown did when he first came into government in 1997 was to establish a framework for public spending. It wasn't called austerity, but that's what it was. And it probably, you know, some people say it was too severe, but anyway, it was disciplined, and it gave the Labour government an enormous amount of credibility. And then won subsequent elections, because the economy was very well managed, actually, for a long period. I mean, the banks got out of control eventually, but most of the Gordon Brown era was a period of good economic management of an independent central bank, and the disciplined framework for public spending and taxation. And any government's going to have that. So to simply say that we no longer have to have any control over public spending and, you know, just go ahead and do what we like, I mean, it's complete nonsense. I mean, and that's potentially one of the bigger problems that Keir Starmer's going to have to grapple with. I mean, a very sensible guy, probably be a very good prime minister, certainly a lot better than the present one. But somehow or other has got to communicate that, you know, our lot, his lot, are going to be able to manage the economy. And that does involve, let's not use the word austerity, but some degree of prioritization, of discipline. These have to be there, whoever is doing it, I'm afraid.
I mean, I would agree with Vince that, you know, politics is all about priorities. It just feels like, you know, as we said you know, we felt working people paid a very high price for austerity. And I have to say, in the midst of COVID, you know, when people are working double shifts because there's no spare capacity, when it takes so long to get the equipment that people needed, very basic equipment, when whole business models of what used to be a local government matter, social care, has now been contracted out, often a lot of family firms that's, you know, struggling really hard, but also a lot of private equity owned firms, where I seriously worry actually about the business model and what happens if one of them goes under. So, you know, I think as we were saying earlier, we've somehow got to get across the idea of how far what we used to call the social wage is an investment for us all. You know, that if, you know, we need decent transport to get to work, we need decent homes to bring up children in, we need investment in skills and education and a health service that can, you know, not just survive, but actually cope properly with, you know, the pandemic and God knows what other disasters may be around the corner. So, you know, that is an investment in our society and ultimately a decent, strong economy too. So, I mean, we haven't cracked it, is the truth, because I think that kind of idea of, as you referred to earlier, Vince, you know, of comparing the economy to the household, I think that has a very deep grip on people's psyche. And yet, you know, if it meant spending money on obviously an electric car to get to work, people would understand that that's worthwhile spending, you know, that ultimately that is about growing your income, whether that's as a family or as a country. But we haven't come up with the stories yet, and I kind of worry for the future if we don't crack it, because we're certainly experiencing austerity light right now, with what's described as a pay freeze is actually a real pay cut for millions of people.
Thank you. Andy, who do we have next?
Yeah.
We've probably got time for just a few more questions, so make them excellent.
Yeah, I've just promoted Ian through, so if you unmute Ian, you can ask your question.
Right, thank you. This is a question for Vince. Would a guaranteed minimum income for all adults, without reducing the incentive to work being anything that is socially beneficial to everybody, would that not address a lot of the issues that have been raised today?
Well, I know this is a very fashionable idea in the party and with a lot of other people on the left. I'm sorry to spoil the evening, but I'm highly skeptical about it. This is a simple solution to a very complicated problem. It depends entirely what level you pitch the income at. I mean, there are some very right-wing Americans arguing for universal basic income because they think they get the state off their backs. Other people want it because they want lots more public spending. So, you know, it depends where you pitch it. It depends how you fund it. If you got rid of, you know, basic tax allowances, which we all enjoy, in order to fund it, the relative merits are not obvious, actually. And I think it's actually avoiding the specifics. I mean, we have a universal credit system, which is much simpler than the one before, but it's very mean. You know, the level is parsimonious. They have this terrible 6-week waits or 7-week waits. You've got, you know, inadequate treatment of people who are self-employed. But if the universal credit system was really made to work properly, and you also dealt with some of the issues around it, around, you know, lack of attention for carers and disabled people and so on, you'd have a much better welfare system without needing to reinvent the wheel and go back to the beginning, which is what a universal basic income is all about. So I suppose maybe my, pragmatic, compromising politician instincts, but my instincts are to work with what we have, and also to as Francis wants, to strengthen workers' rights and have decent pay and conditions, rather than to create some completely new welfare system that will create as many anomalies as we got, but the different ones.
Can I just point out that I wasn't proposing a universal basic income.
Ah, sorry.
I was proposing a guaranteed minimum income.
Yeah, but isn't that the same thing?
No, because you wouldn't be giving money to millionaires and people like that. It would be based on income tax. Well, Milton Friedman's negative income tax type of thing.
Well, the fact that Milton Friedman advocated it makes me a bit suspicious. Anyway, maybe we need to pursue this offline.
Thank you, Ian. Andy, who do we have next? Sorry, we're going to speed through it to give a few more people a chance to ask.
Definitely. We've got Beverly, who's got a couple of questions, so I'll ask you to choose one of those. He's just coming through now.
Hi, Beverly.
Hi, Beverly.
Could unmute yourself, please.
Oh, thank you. Sorry, I'm completely unprepared here. Hi, I can't seem to get my camera to work, but if you can hear me, very good. Thanks so much. Really, really interesting discussion. Thank you both so much. I had 3 questions spanning whether we should be opening the economy again, Vince, in light of new variants. But I think I'll just, whether you agreed with the PM's top 10 points for the green industrial revolution, but I thought I'd focus on actually whether you see the current trading border trading problems post-Brexit as teething problems, or whether we need a new set of dentures.
That's a nice metaphor. Yeah. Well, they're more than teething problems. I mean, the metaphor I've been using is about bicycles, really, which is that we're heading for a long, slow puncture. I mean, I've never believed actually that Brexit is going to precipitate some terrible overnight catastrophe, which is the kind of thing George Osborne used to warn us about, did more harm than good, I think. But it clearly is, damaging, and it's damaging particularly for manufacturing industries which no longer have the European market to focus on, for a lot of service sectors that aren't covered at all. And it will slow down the economy and inhibit recovery, and it's throwing up quite a lot of red tape. I mean, I thought it was hilarious this morning to hear the Prime Minister talking about a bonfire of regulation. I mean, he's actually created one. So, yes, I mean, it is going to be damaging, and it is more than teething problems.
Thank you. Thanks, Vince. Francis, I don't know whether you have any views on that.
I do have very strong views on this. And I think it's backed up by the evidence that ultimately this is going to be much more damaging than COVID in terms of our medium to longer term growth prospects, or that we would have, had a better chance of. Obviously, we want to distribute prosperity more fairly, but in terms of growing our prosperity, it's in the first place, it's damaging. And, I'm in touch with business leaders and unions kind of every week, facing more checks, more red tape, more hassle. And of course, for the 80% of our economy that is services, and 80% of jobs that are in services, it's not a picnic either. I mean, I would be fascinated to hear from Vince his thoughts about how we, in my view, prepare the ground. Nobody's talking about, frankly, I don't think Brussels would have the appetite for an entirely new deal. But if we're not to wave goodbye to significant parts of the real economy and the decent jobs that go with them, then we've got to find a way to improve on this what I see as a pretty third-rate deal. You know, it just feels this incredible irony that this was all supposed to be about taking back control and sovereignty, you know, and one of our truckers can't even take his ham sandwich. And, you know, it just, I will obviously be, you know, I don't think it helps at all to do the I told you so. I really don't think that helps, but I do think we've got to kind of move forward to, in a very practical way, how can we prepare the ground for seeking an improvement for both parties in a deal that I think will make us all poorer, but frankly, the UK a lot poorer than our European partners.
Thank you so much.
Any, would you like to come in there?
I think one step that if we did get a change of government, and given where we're all starting from, I think rejoining the customs union is a deliverable objective. It doesn't compromise the spirit of Brexit. I think actually those of us who were fighting Brexit in Parliament made a tactical mistake when we didn't vote for that, actually. It would have eased quite a lot of the issues for certainly for industry. And would be a step to re-establishing close relationship.
Yeah, yeah.
Thank you. Andy, I think we might have time for one more question.
Great, yes.
Oh,
we're
going
to... Yep, I will bring through Duncan. Sorry, things are moving around on my screen. Duncan, I'm going to ask you to come through. And I think you've got like 4 questions. So if I could just ask you to ask one question. And I think we'll probably say like 60-second answers, if that's all right. Just promoting you through now.
Hi, Duncan. Could you unmute yourself? It's good to...
My interest is in about rundown areas, about how should they be revitalized. And I was wondering if Vince or Francis have any ideas about which industries would be particularly suitable to grow and revitalize those areas.
Well, if you're asking me, the trouble is there are no simple solutions here. I mean, you know, we've been trying what was called regional policy, which is a regeneration, for 50, 60 years. And there've been some moderate successes and a lot of failures. And there's no kind of magic. I mean, I was part of one moderately successful thing when I was a young man as a Glasgow City Councillor, and we did a lot to regenerate the city. And you know, we just need to look back on those models. And I think it's partly getting the right kind of mix of housing and employment. There is no particular industry that you know will chart all this through. I think the one key thing that is currently missing from most of these ideas is actually local participation. Unless you get local communities, local councillors actually doing the heavy lifting, nothing worthwhile will happen. It will be superimposed from above. So it's got to be a bottom-up process supported by government money.
That's great, thank you.
I would really agree with Vince that there are about local voice, but also there are rarely quick fixes. And that's one of the reasons why I think, you know, those of us who are champions of industrial policy need to work really hard to try and build a broad consensus, because it, you know, you've got to stick at it. It takes resilience to make that real change that we want to see in the areas that need it most. Just one area I would also add, and that's our high streets, where I think, you know, obviously we've got lots of shop workers in membership, but we know there are big changes in the retail industry. I think we are going to have to reimagine our high streets and fast to make them, hopefully once we get through this crisis, vibrant places once more. And I would put in a really strong bid for our creative industries that have had such a tough time during this crisis, and yet are so important to us as a people, as human beings. And that is something that actually could be done relatively quickly, is to really rethink our high streets in terms of the cultural offer to local people. And I think that could, be a real boost to the quality of life of many local communities.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Andy.
Thanks, Duncan, and thank you to everyone who submitted questions. I'm sorry we can't get to everyone, but I think that's all we've got time for. And I'll pass back over to Sue to
Brilliant. Thank you very much. I'm going to end off by inviting Vincent Francis to say something, just a few final points, perhaps if there's one key priority you think we should be considering. So going back to kind of the title for tonight, priorities for a new economy, what do you think? If you had to choose one, what would that be? And then I'm going to invite Ian to talk a bit about upcoming events and invite you to join the Social Liberal Forum, everyone who's watching who hasn't yet. So over to you, Sir Vince.
I think the one big point that hasn't really come through is the generational issue. It's true what Francis said, which is that over the last decade, and indeed for longer, real income after inflation, have fallen and certainly haven't risen. And a lot of working families have been put into poverty, even though somebody in the household is working, which is a shocking state of affairs. But actually, there's one group of people who've done quite well in the last decade, and they're pensioners under the triple lock. Every year, their real income has either been guaranteed or has increased. We no longer talk about pensioner poverty. There probably is some, but it's not a social problem. And the pandemic is basically the response, shutting down the economy with terrible consequences, has been to help people like me live a few more years longer, which is very nice, but it is at the expense of younger people. And I think in all the policy responses, we do really need to keep that uppermost. The first priority, the first call when we come out of this is going to be do what we can to restore the incomes of low-income working families, to pour money into education, which has been badly hit. I mean, I think, and redress this generational inequality that has become really quite extreme.
I think from me, Sue, if I may, I think I want to say that for us, the biggest threat we face, the biggest enemy, if you like, is mass unemployment, and the biggest prize is full employment, full good employment, because whatever different views on minimum incomes and so on, I think most of us, we go to work and we want to do a good job, we want to feel proud of what we do, and we want to be treated and rewarded fairly. And that to me doesn't seem like pie in the sky. That should be, any government of any colour should be looking to provide decent work for its people. And my second kind of final point really is that I think we need to work on cherishing key workers, by which I mean not just NHS and social care, but actually all of those workers who have continued to keep us going, look after the rest of us through this crisis. And I'm not just talking about their pay packets. I think there is a very deep feeling amongst many of the key workers I talk to that they want to feel respected, and they want to be treated well and seen as human beings with families of their own. And just finally to thank you really as the kind of, if you like, being brought in as one of your guests. I've really enjoyed this session and really appreciate the invitation, so thank you.
Thank you very much. It's been a fascinating, enlightening, sobering, and I hope galvanizing conversation. Thank you so much, Francis, and thank you so much, Sir Vince, for all your time and thoughts and insights. It's been excellent, and thank you for everyone who's joined us and asked such great questions and tuned in and made comments in the chat. this is exactly what we're here to do as a social liberal forum, the home for social liberalism in Britain. And I'm very glad that Ian Brodie-Brown is going to join us. He's our chair, and talk a bit about, very briefly, about the SLF and upcoming events and activities.
Thanks, Sue.
Over to you, Ian.
Thank you, and thank you, Sue, for chairing it again so well, and to the team that have put it together, Chris Filmon, a team, Virginia Moore, Richard Robinson, Andy at the controls there. Thank you all very much. Can I say we've got more events coming up like this now. Leila Moran has agreed to do a session laying out her approach to her new portfolio as Foreign Affairs spokesman. Before that, though, William Wallace, known to many of us, great respected commentator on foreign affairs, is going to do a session for us on Britain's role post-Trump, post-COVID, post-Brexit, and I think lay out some of the challenges there. And I think we're all looking forward to that. William's confirmed today that he's going to do that, and we look forward to that. As well as that, we're about to publish a new report from our colleague Edward Robinson on climate, on the challenge of climate change, and that will be on our website as a published report shortly. And there will be a webinar like this to accompany it. You've seen the stuff about Citizens Britain, and we're looking forward to doing a web event on that as well with John Alexander and Ian Cairns. We're looking at how we reimagine beverage for a new age, and we've got a session packed up with Professor Pat Bain on that, which will be coming on as well. Can I just also draw your attention to the website? I think Beverly Nielsen's question about Brexit brought this to mind for me. Stephen Farry, who's the Alliance MP for Northern Ireland, has just submitted to us a very fine article on the impact of Brexit, looking at Northern Ireland in particular, which I think will be on the website shortly, and I hope you'll have a look at that too, please. So that's all from me. Thank you very much. Please join the SLF if you haven't. Go to the website. I'm sure that we'll be sending you an email to chase you who've been here today. Thank you very much. Cheers. Over to you, Sue.
Thank you very much, Ian. And I'd just love to thank everyone and have a lovely evening. And see you soon.